In this episode, we're going to look at the new NIV Application Bible. This is from Zondervan. It just came out recently, and a Dojo viewer sent me this copy and asked for my thoughts on it. So this is not paid by Zondervan. This was a viewer who said, "I'm curious about this Bible." They sent one, as we do with all our Bible reviews. If you send me one, and I haven't already reviewed it, obviously, then I'm happy to take a look at it. And if I think it's good for a review, then I'm happy to share my thoughts here on the Dojo as well. So I spent about a week with this one, and here are my thoughts. So the NIV Application Bible is a study Bible that has pulled from the one-volume version of the NIV Application Commentary. We've looked at this here on the channel. I've actually reviewed this as a resource, so I'll link that below in the video description. And this commentary series, as we talked about in that video, was based on the NIV Application Commentary series. This is just the volume by Tremper Longman on Daniel, but there's the entire library of the NIV Application Commentary. This was published back in the 90s and through the 2000s. It's a whole huge set. This got distilled into a one-volume commentary on the whole Bible, and then this got distilled even further into the study notes for this study Bible. So that's the difference between this and this. Now, the NIV Application Bible is not to be confused with the Life Application Study Bible. I know it can get a little confusing. Life Application Study Bible, this is published by Tyndale. Previous versions, I think, were published by Zondervan, but this is Life Application Study Bible. This is just NIV Application Bible. Two entirely different things. The only thing these have in common is the words application and Bible. But the Life Application Study Bible is available in multiple translations. For instance, this is the New Living Translation. It's also available in NIV and King James, maybe even New King James. It used to be available in Holman Christian Standard and New American Standard. I'm not sure if this third edition is available in that because of licensing and publishing and all of that kind of stuff that I don't know or care about that much. So keep these two separate in your minds. The NIV Application Bible, 2,242 pages. It's a red letter edition. It's double columned with center cross-reference and study notes at the bottom of each page. It's full color. The maps, the charts, the illustrations throughout, all full color. And then there are 14 of the Zondervan maps in the back. So let's take a look at it. So this is the hardback edition. It comes in other editions as well. I'm sure this is just what the viewer sent me. Comes with 2 ribbon bookmarks, which is nice. 2 is always better than 1. And we're going to take off this dust jacket, and this is what it looks like. So you open it up, presentation page. It's all full color. All the pages are full color. Came out this year, 2025. So you have table of contents. Then you have the preface to the Application Bible. Then you have the introduction to the Application Bible. It tells you the difference between the Application Bible and the Application Commentary. It also gives you some of the symbols that are used to mark. This little cross symbol signifies notes that have to do with one of the 4 areas of Bible study, either discovery, study, connection, or application. Gives you an overview of what you're going to find in the book introductions, the charts, the maps. Notes having to do with the original meaning of the passage will be these notes in white. And then application notes will be marked with the little cross emblem, and they will be offset in this like purplish gray. Then there will be these little orange boxes, or brown or tan or whatever color you want to call this. These are questions for growth. So reflection questions or maybe small group discussion questions. Then there are articles, people to know, or the character of God. So these purpley blue boxes are going to be biography. The ones that are this orangish brown color are going to be the character of God. This one is God as creator at Genesis 1:1. Then in the back, there are some different reading plans. We'll look at those when we get there. And then there's a NIV dictionary concordance. So it's not an exhaustive concordance. It is a dictionary. It does define the terms, and it gives a few places where you can find that particular term. There's also a mobile app. If you buy this copy of the Bible, then you have free access to the NIV Application Bible study notes in mobile form. So you just scan this QR code. I have not done this yet. My phone is old. I do not want to install any more apps on it because it's already busting at the seams. But check this out and see if that interests you. Then we come to the preface to the NIV, and this is the NIV 2011, not the 1984 NIV. Then after that, we have an updated version of the Zondervan Study Bible timeline, so multiple pages, prehistory. These don't have any dates associated with them. Then around 2500 BC is when you start to get into biblical history, the things that we can start to date. And they compare it to the other ancient kingdoms as well, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia. So it's telling you what's going on in the larger world, what's going on in the biblical world. So it's about 5 pages worth. Then we come to the Old Testament. There's no essays in this. You just jump right into the book introductions. They have a full color picture, some quick notes about the author, the audience, the date, and the theme. These are all based on traditional conservative dating or views of authorship. So for instance, they have Genesis as being authored by Moses. There would be scholars who would contest that. Some would say Moses compiled it. Some would say Moses had nothing to do with it. It wasn't until long after Moses' death. This is just going with the traditional view in this section, even though some of the commenters whose study notes they're pulling from would not hold that view. And so then the perspective, it doesn't go deep in historical or cultural background. It stays kind of at a more general level, just about how to read Genesis, maybe more literarily, and then more, of course, application focused. There's a section taking the next steps, which kind of talks about like, okay, what does Genesis say to us today? Like, why do we care about this ancient document? It says Genesis is like a mirror in which we can see our own lives. We too are infected with sin. Like Adam and Eve, we have disobeyed God's will. Like Jacob, we are out to get our own way, regardless of whom we hurt along the way. But God freely offers us his forgiving grace, just as he did to our first parents in the Garden of Eden. So just kind of showing how Genesis fits within this application-focused understanding of the gospel. Then after that, there's a what to look for in Genesis. And this just kind of breaks it down by sections, kind of an outline. Then we come to the actual text of Genesis, a map with possible locations of the Garden of Eden, either up here or down here, both with question marks. First note on the character of God. This is the biblical text. These are the study notes. They give, when it comes to the day, what the word day means. It says day could mean, number 1, the daylight hours. Number 2, a 24-hour day. Number 3, special days. Number 4, a plural use that can refer to a few days or even a year. Number 5, the definite article can be added to make it mean today. Like the day would be how you say today. Or 6, a preposition can be tacked on the front and a demonstrative pronoun associated with it to say in that day, or simply when. So if you want to say when such and such happened, in Hebrew you would say in that day or in the day of such and such. So it gives you all the possible meanings of day. And then it says it's difficult to conclude that anything other than a 24-hour day was intended. It's not the text that causes people to think otherwise, but the demands of trying to harmonize the text with modern science. So they don't come out and flat out say this is, read this as a literal 24-hour days, but they do say that the text is presenting it as normal, regular days, and that's how people would have read it until they looked at other factors that would make them rethink, wait a minute, is that the correct reading or not? But they don't go into more detail about it. And then these are the notes, by the way. John Walton did the volume in Genesis. So the notes of this text are being pulled from John Walton's interpretation of Genesis in the application commentary series. And you can see that in the notes. There's a lot of notes having to do with function. And if you know Walton, you know he's a big proponent of the functional view of Genesis. Genesis is using normal everyday language, but not to describe literal events. It's describing how the universe was created to function. So it's not giving a literal description of the events, like if you were there with a video camera watching, this is what it would have looked like. Rather, it's presenting it in a way that highlights God bringing function and order to chaos and disorder. So it says in the note on 1:6, day 2 describes the setting up of the vault, sometimes translated firmament, perceived by the original readers of Genesis as a solid dome. Its function was to regulate the weather, as is evident from the description of the waters above. The author has apparently used the cosmological language available to him, that's the ancient Near East conception of the world, with a dome over it and the waters above being let through that dome to rain down on the earth, and the sea below the earth and the foundation of the mountains, all that kind of stuff, the cosmological view of the ancients. Says he's used that to describe weather. The intention of the text is not to convey structure, but function. So this would be something of phenomenological language, describing something as it appears, but in Walton's view, borrowing from the categories of the ancient world in order to present it, to highlight the function not the structure, not the science, but the theology. So that's what you're going to get overall in Genesis. Then we come to Exodus, and there's a typo here. I'll just show you real quick. So this will probably be corrected in subsequent printings, hopefully. In the reading Exodus section, it says Exodus divides into two main sections. Chapters 10 through 18 outline the history of the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt, their miraculous escape under the leadership of Moses, and their journey through the wilderness to Mount Sinai. Chapters 19 through 40 describe the events that occurred at Mount Sinai, including the laws by which God wanted his people to live. That is not chapter 10. That should say chapter 1 through 18. So minor typo nonetheless. Now they go with the traditional dates: author Moses, audience God's chosen people, the Israelites, date between 1446, 1406. The notes, however, from Exodus come from Peter Enns' volume of Exodus in the NIV Application Commentary. I am positive Peter Enns would not agree with this dating of the Exodus. As far as I know, he accepts documentary theories. Maybe at one point back in his days when he wrote this commentary, maybe he leaned this way. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I don't think so. I think Enns has always been non-traditional in his understanding of certainly Mosaic authorship. So this may be a case where the editors went one way, but then the actual study notes that they were using come from somebody who would not lean in that direction. But there's not a lot of, there's some history. It doesn't go into detail about who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It doesn't get into a lot of the archaeology. It does talk about in the study notes the impact that the plagues, the signs, the wonders that God did would have had on the different realms of the gods of Egypt. Like, for instance, the turning the Nile into blood, that was very much an attack on the lifeblood of Egypt. The Nile was a personified god to the Egyptians. They lived by the annual flooding of the Nile and the sediment that it brought to make the land fertile. And so judgment on that is a huge theological statement to the Egyptians. Same thing they note about Heket, the goddess of childbirth, is the Egyptian god depicted with the head of a frog. And so they talk about the resonances that the plague of frogs would have had, this overabundance of frogs being everywhere, and how that would express God's sovereignty over the Egyptian fertility goddess in that instance. Same thing with the plagues on the livestock and the Egyptian god Hathor, who had the head of a cow. This was seen as another psychological blow to Pharaoh's perceived source of strength. The plague of darkness, they talk about, that was certainly targeted at the main god of Egypt, Ra, the sun god, turning the land that worshiped the sun god, who Pharaoh himself was seen as the son of Ra, turning that to darkness. Huge theological statement. So you are getting some of that background. There's a chart that has the different Hebrew events, the Hebrew calendar, the festivals, what days they fall on. There's a map that gives two proposed routes to Sinai. Unfortunately, they both are to the traditional Jebel Musa location, not to the alternate Jebel Musa location in Midian itself. So you're just getting two of the three proposed views. Actually, there's more than three, but kind of the main views, you're only getting two of them. This is a disappointing map, but it's not surprising. I haven't seen a Zondervan resource other than the Archaeological Study Bible, which unfortunately is out of print. Zondervan, bring it back. It's the best study Bible you've ever published, and in part because it has stuff like other Exodus accounts and the arguments in favor of each, and just for the more informed reader. This doesn't get into any of that, but that's not the purpose of this study Bible. Remember, this is the Application Bible. So it is much heavier on what does this text mean to me than the archaeological, historical, cultural background. Now, later in Exodus, this was nice to see. There's a full color illustration of the tabernacle and the different implements having to do with the tabernacle, and then the furnishings of the tabernacle. These are nice illustrations. They're helpful. They explain, they give you a good visual, a good image to put with it. That is always helpful in a study Bible when you come to these later chapters of Exodus, where it's just easy to get bogged down in directions on how to build this mobile tent that's going to be God's home, this miniature Mount Sinai that's going to follow Israel around everywhere. You can glaze over real fast. So this is nice whenever they do include illustrations of that. Now, when we get to the New Testament, at the beginning, there's a New Testament timeline, just like there was at the beginning of the Bible, the Old Testament. There's a 2-page New Testament timeline. And then there is a chart of messianic prophecies fulfilled. So they're arranged chronologically, starting in Genesis, through the prophets, through the Psalms, and then their fulfillment in the New Testament. That's about 3 pages. And then we come to Matthew. So this is the layout. Words of Jesus are in red. When we come to Romans, the notes from Romans are from Doug Moo. There's a brief overview, and the overview for Romans was done very well. It did lay out the tensions that the church in Rome was experiencing between Jewish followers of Jesus and Gentile followers of Jesus, and what happens when those two cultures clash. There's also a nice overview of ancient Rome in the first century, what the city itself looked like. The notes are pretty standard, generally evangelical. When you get to Romans 7, it does take the view that Paul is describing something having to do with his own inner struggle. It does not list the different views of Romans 7s and the I that Paul is speaking as someone who is in Adam, still in sin in Romans 7, and then is going to experience freedom in Christ in Romans 8. It takes a more traditional Augustinian Lutheran approach that Paul is, as they say, trying to reveal the force within himself that leads him to act as he does. That force is called sin. So you're only getting one view of Romans 7. Cards on the table, I don't think that's the correct view of Romans 7. And if you want to know why, see my interview here in the dojo with Dr. Joey Dodson, and where we talk about his book all about who is the I in Romans chapter 7. This is the lesser plausible reading to me, but they didn't even mention the other view. And that I find to be a weakness in any study Bible. When you get to Romans 9, the notes, predestination, free will, they don't really try to give a position. They do read Jacob and Esau as individuals. They do not take the reading that Paul is talking corporately. Again, I want to be transparent. I think that's incorrect. I think the passage Paul is citing from Malachi specifically is using Jacob and Esau to refer to corporate peoples. But they say it's difficult to think that Paul switches from this personal reference to a corporate one without warning in verse 13. Doug Moo, I just think you're wrong on this. I think it's not at all difficult. I think it's quite natural. But I know that this, again, is an area where Christians disagree. So it would have been nice to see a little more engagement on this issue and presenting more even-handedly what the debate is. When it comes to predestination, free will, there's a little application note here, and this is kind of the approach they take. It says, however much we may want to claim that salvation is based on God's choice, we must also, and that would be the Calvinist view, salvation is all God's choice. We must also insist that the human decision to believe is also both real and critical. And that would be what Arminians want to emphasize, that humans have to choose to accept the gospel or not. We are not puppets in God's hands, passively moving as he directs. Rather, we are responsible human beings called by God to exercise faith in his Son. The evidence of Scripture compels us to maintain a fine balance at this point. And then in the note at 919, they say Paul offers no logical explanation of how God's determinative will and human responsibility interact. Rather than taking the defensive, Paul further asserts God's freedom to do as he wants with his creatures. What right does the created being have to complain about how God has made him? God has the right to fashion from the clay the kinds of vessels he wants. The parallel with objects of his wrath and, quote, objects of his mercy suggests he is thinking of God's freedom to choose some people to be saved and leave others in their spiritual deadness. So this would be a more Calvinistic view. God chooses to rescue some, and he chooses to leave others to be eternally damned. Double predestination would be he chooses to save some, and he chooses to actively condemn others. Single predestination is he just chooses to rescue some, and the others are left to their own fate. For Arminians, they look at both of those and they go, there's no ethical difference between both of those. If you choose to only rescue some, you are actively choosing to damn others if you could have rescued all. So this will wade heavily into the Calvinist Arminian waters of debate. They're not hard Calvinists, but they if I had to put them on the, like, this is Calvinism, this is Arminianism, I'd put the notes probably like right about here. When we get to Romans 11 and the all Israel will be saved, they take the approach, and this is a part where they do not give any overview of the various positions on this. They just say, Paul suggests that the return of Israel to favor with God will occur at the climax of history when the dead are raised. And so what does that mean for non-Jesus following ethnically or religiously Jewish people? They say, what does Paul mean by all Israel? Here's where they conclude. We think all Israel refers to some Israelites as a representative whole. If the reference is to a single generation of Israel, Paul seems to indicate Israel as it exists in the end times. Paul predicts the salvation of a significant number of Jews at the time of Christ's return in glory. So they just explained it in the application note. This chapter teaches that a significant number of Jews will come to salvation in the last days. Those Jews who are converted will become integrated into the Christian church, although perhaps a church on its way to heaven if the conversion happens at the time of Jesus's second coming. So again, this is one way this text is read, and there are others who read it this way. Ben Witherington reads the text this way, and there are numerous others, but this is not the only way this text is read. Others like N.T. Wright or our friend Jason Staples have made strong arguments. I think they're compelling arguments, but it'll be up to each person, that no, the all Israel is everyone who's come to faith in Jesus, Jew and Gentile together throughout the course of human history. So not some, and maybe at some point there might be more ethnic Jews coming to faith. God is certainly free to orchestrate history how he wants, but that this text is not pointing to a future time when there'll be a massive influx of ethnically Jewish believers in Jesus. They would say, no, this is talking about the entire process and the tree, Jew and Gentile, broken off branches and wild branches that have been grafted in, together form the olive tree, of which Jesus is the trunk and the roots and all of it. So just know you're not really getting any discussion in that regard in Romans chapter 11. When we come to passages having to do with complementarianism, egalitarianism, 1 Corinthians 14, they take the approach that when Paul commands women to be silent, it doesn't mean across the board. It means be silent in the context of authoritatively interpreting prophecy, because that's what he's talking about in that section. And then he says, as in 11, 2 through 16, the women whom Paul silences may only be wives. This would explain why they must not publicly challenge the church's prophecies, but consult at home. To do otherwise might be to challenge their husbands in church in ways that would contradict their God-ordained submission to them. Verse 34. And verse 34 is the verse that says women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. In the NIV 2011, law is lowercase because there is nowhere in Torah, anywhere, that the law says women must be in submission to men or must remain silent. So that's why the interpreters have said this is probably Paul's talking about either Roman law or maybe some general principle of the society at the time. But what he's not talking about is Torah, because there is nowhere in Torah where women are commanded to be silent or to be in submission. But nevertheless, that's what you're getting in the study note at 1 Corinthians 14. When you come to Ephesians 5, wives, submit to your husbands. There's some notes that talk about the instruction to wives to submit to their husbands is only the first example of the mutual submission required of all Christians. And of course, that's the text. Verse 21 of Ephesians 5, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Then verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands. And that verb submit is not actually in the Greek text. It just says literally, wives, yourselves to your husbands. So this verb gets imported even in the NIV 2011. And so the note says, that the wife's relation to the Lord is the basis, motivation, and qualification of her submission to her husband. And then the whole Christ is the head of the church. So the husband is the head of the wife. What does that mean? It says, this is surely one of the most abused and debated texts in the New Testament. Its focus is not on the privilege and dominance of the husband. Paul never intended to suggest that wives were servants, compelled to follow the husband's every desire. The text does not give any license for husbands to attempt to force submission. The debate has intensified in recent years over the meaning of the Greek word for head. It's the word kephale. The context of Ephesians and Paul's other writings is the most important factor for determining the meaning of this word. The argument for source as the meaning is not convincing. So some scholars have said kephale doesn't mean head like your head on a body or head of an organization. It means head like in the head of a river, the source of something, the origin. And so they're saying that's not a likely meaning in this context. Scholars appear to have chosen this meaning only to avoid negative connotations for discussion of male-female relations in modern times. So they're saying people that have suggested that head means source is just because they're trying to read modern, feminist motivation into the text. Some connotation of authority appears to be included. Still, verse 23 does not focus on authority. The husband has a leadership role, though not to boss his wife or use his position as privilege. Just as Jesus redefined greatness as being a servant, Paul redefines this as having responsibility to love, to give oneself, and to nurture. The text also assumes the oneness and equality of husband and wife. in verse 28 and 31, both headship and equality must be given their due. As elsewhere, the truth is in the tension of the text. I would put this in the soft complementarian category. This would not be Wayne Grudem, John Piper, Doug Wilson, hard complementarianism. This would be complementarianism, but not as extreme. That's how the notes read to me, at least. But no space is given to the egalitarian readings of this, other than saying some read it as source, but that's not likely. And then lastly, we come to 1 Timothy 2, the I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. They say 2:8, everywhere should caution us against any assumption that Paul's instructions in our passage apply only to the church at Ephesus. So they're arguing against Paul speaking just to the Ephesians in the Ephesian context about what was going on at Ephesus, because in verse 8, he had said, therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. And then verse 9, he says, I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves. So they're saying that because he says, I want the men everywhere to do this, that doesn't mean everywhere you are gathered in Ephesus. It means everywhere at every church, which is in line with the complementarian position. And then the notes on the I do not permit a woman to teach, but she should learn in quietness and full submission. They say the attitude of quietness in verses 11 through 12 can be understood as ruling out teaching, and the attitude of submission as ruling out exercising authority. This would not have been surprising to either Jews or Greeks, since neither culture permitted women to teach. Now, elsewhere, that attitude of quietness, that same term, I believe men are called to exercise that as well. So clearly, that quietness in and of itself does not rule out teaching. It's a conditioned quietness. It's a type of an attitude rather than silence itself. And submission, ruling out exercising authority. Also, Paul just in Ephesians said, submit to one another. And then yet within that, there were also, authority positions within the church, but yet it's still called to mutual submission. So I don't agree. I just think that note is overstating the case for sure. But then they talk about verse 12. There's considerable body of literature on the meaning of this verse. Proper understanding of Paul's introductory words, I do not permit, requires comment. Can it be paraphrased, I am not now permitting, with the implication that Paul may permit it in the future, but does not at the present time for some temporary reason? That may be the case, though it seems more likely a normal use of expressing simple facts. So they acknowledge that some have made the argument, Paul saying, I am not currently permitting the women in Ephesus to teach and have usurp authority over men, but that he's not making a blanket statement. They say that's a possibility, but not likely. Teach probably refers to the authoritative communication of the faith. To assume authority, that's the Greek word althein, is not as clear in its meaning because it is a very obscure word. Paul I don't think uses it anywhere else. But then they kind of fall back to the complementarian view. The clause in verse 12 specifically limits its prohibition of teaching and having authority to exercising these over a man, or, as some suggest, over a woman's own husband, prohibiting for the sake of orderliness and the household codes in the Greco-Roman society. Paul is saying for women, wives, not to start domineering and usurping authority of their husbands. And that could be anything from missiological reasons to theological reasons. I say this does not rule out, even in those circumstances, any other ministry for women. So women can do everything else, just not teaching over men or a wife not having authority over her husband. Those would be two different types of complementarianism. And so then the woman will be saved through childbearing. They give the different views of what that means. They say it's been subject to much study. It could mean saved through the ordeal of childbearing, in which case salvation refers to its broader meaning, to preservation or rescue. So, half of all women in some places in the ancient world died in childbearing. So it's not a minor thing to tell a woman you will be protected through childbearing. That's not insignificant. So that could be one approach. The other is saved, meaning through the means of childbearing. But they say in which case it appears to clash with the doctrine of salvation by grace alone, because women are saved by grace through faith in Jesus, not having children. So then a third option, it could be saved through the ordeal of and by the means of childbearing. And then a fourth possibility, however, makes it possible that a particular instance of childbirth is in mind, because he says we'll be saved through the childbearing. There's a definite article there in the Greek text. It doesn't say you'll be saved through childbearing in general. It says you will be saved through the childbearing. And so they say usually understood to be the birth of Christ. In other words, the child that saves women is Jesus. That was the childbirth that saves everyone. And so then to sum it up in their application note, they say, here kind of the two options you have. If Paul's restrictions were intended to keep women from doing missionary teaching of men today, from leading a mixed Bible study, or from serving among a group of elders, so if the complementarian position is true, those restrictions must not be ignored. And complementarians would say, amen. If, on the other hand, Paul would have valued as primary such missionary principles as not hindering people from the gospel, and if he considered secondary such practices as women's wearing head coverings and restricting women's teaching of a mixed group, we need to be consistent in that regard. So we can't just cherry pick passages from Paul that exclude women from teaching, but then ignore passages from Paul that have to do with things like head coverings, or I would even add greeting one another with a holy kiss. You can't say, oh, well, those are just culture. But the prohibitions against women teaching, those are for all time. They're saying, no, if it's not the case, then we need to be consistent. And that would be in line with the egalitarian position. So then they end, no doubt thoughtful readers will see strong points on each side. And that is true. Thoughtful, biblical, faithful, spirit-filled evangelical Christians have different positions when it comes to the passages on egalitarianism and complementarianism. And anyone who says otherwise is either ignorant or they are lying to you. So overall, the notes in this are fairly complementarian, but not extreme complementarian. And they do at least note that there's thoughtful, faithful disagreement. And then lastly, we come to Revelation. The notes for Revelation were done by Craig Keener. He wrote the volume in the Life Application Commentary series on Revelation. And the preface that kind of orients you to the text does a good job of saying Revelation needed to make sense to the original audience. And if we go to it reading it for end times stuff, like who is the beast and what world empires do we need to be watching for and what's Russia and Iran have to do with Israel and China and all that kind of stuff, then that robs the book of any meaning that it would have had to its original readers, which is absolutely true. It can't mean to us what it never meant to them, even if it can have extrapolations in our day and age. It was written to first century Christians in Asia Minor at the seven churches. So we have to take that into account when reading Revelation. It does take the view that John, the Apostle John, it says was probably the apostle was the author. There is some disagreement on which John wrote Revelation. And they lay out at the beginning the three different millennial views, and then one that they call the apocalyptic, which I think would qualify as the preterist view. I haven't seen the term apocalyptic used to describe a specific view of the millennium. So this I'll have a little bit of question on. But it comes from H. Wayne House, Chronological Background Charts of the New Testament, which I think I just have the Old Testament volume. So I don't know if this apocalyptic is talking about preterism or not. I think it is. That's my hunch. But anyway, it goes postmillennial, amillennial, premillennial. And it tells you how they read Revelation 1 through 3, 4 through 19, and 20 through 22, the three big chunks of the book. In Revelation, there is good discussion about the historical background. You get a map of the seven churches, and then the notes give you what was going on at those churches. The note at Laodicea, which you always look at, these notes absolutely nail it. They talk about the water supply, how it didn't have its own fresh water, and so the water there made people sick. It had all of this impurities in it. It was neither hot nor cold. It was lukewarm. They talked about the city famous for its textiles and its black wool. They talk about the medical school that was there and the eye salve from Phrygian powder that was developed there. So this gives you the background historically. So when you read Jesus's words to the church at Laodicea, you're able to see what he was saying much more clearly. So good job on the history of the seven churches. They also do a good job tying the 144,000 to a military census, which the NIV helps by laying it out like a census. And that's what it is. It's a military census. And so then they give the different views of so who constitutes this army, this 144,000 strong army from the tribes of Israel. And they make the conclusion the 144,000 represent all those destined for the new Jerusalem, Jew and Gentile together, because when John turns and actually looks at this crowd, he doesn't see 144,000. He sees a vast multitude from every tribe, every nation, but they don't unpack that a lot in the notes. So if that's a new reading to you, if you only know, let's say, a dispensationalist reading where the 144,000, these are ethnic Jews that are going to be saved during the tribulation after the church's rapture, like if that's all you know, then this might be new to you. So it doesn't give, the alternative views of the 144,000, but I do think the view it gives is the most likely correct one. And then when it comes to 666, for instance, they don't go into detail about how Gematria worked and how 666 would have been pointing at Nero Caesar, Neron Caesar, Nero Caesar. But they do say most commentators find an allusion to Nero Caesar's name as written in the Hebrew characters here. So you just get a passing mention of it, but you're going to have to open the commentary itself to get more. And then lastly, Revelation 20, there's a long note on the millennium, and they say it's divided into three broad schools of thought: premillennialist, amillennialist, postmillennialist. And they say most evangelicals today are premillennialist or amillennialist, and that is correct. And then so they spell out why amillennialists take the approach they do, and then why premillennialists take the approach. They don't give an overview of postmillennialists because that's the extreme minority position today. And they don't give preterist or dispensational premillennialism. So then after Revelation, you got your table of weights and measures. Then you have an index to all of the features. So all these character of God essays, they're listed there. All of the biographical sketches, people to know, they're listed there. Where the maps are, all of the charts. And then they have the contributors to the volumes in the NIV application series. So you know who did the study notes for each book based on this. And then they let you know the overall general editor of the commentary was Terry Muck, and then the application Bible consulting editors, Karen Jobes, Trimper Longman, Scott McKnight, Doug Moo, and John Walton. Then after that, you have some reading plans, 52 weeks on the character of God. So you could do different topical readings. Then they have just read through the Bible in a year, and then through the Bible in 3 years. After that, the dictionary concordance, and it's only about 20 pages or so. Then the index to the maps, then the maps, and then that's it. So what are my thoughts after spending a week reviewing this? My thoughts are basically, it's not bad. It's as far as study Bibles go overall. Would this be a fine primary study Bible? It'd be fine. Would it be my first choice? No, it wouldn't be my first choice. Things I like about it, it's full color, which is nice. It's not too dogmatically tied to one particular stream of theology, but it is a little. You get a little bit of it, but not, I mean, compared to other study Bibles, every study Bible has biases, and very few are able to be as objective as what makes a really, really good study Bible. So this one, in some places, I think it's fine. In some places, I think it leaves out too much. The application notes, I just didn't think they were that good, honestly. For what it's trying to do, Life Application already does it and does it a lot better. I think the Life Application Study Bible does way better in every aspect what the NIV Application Bible is trying to do. Now, Life Application is not full color in its pages. It doesn't have the photographs and as many illustrations. So, if that's your thing. But overall, this seems unnecessary if you have access to this. That's what it comes down to for me. If you have the one volume commentary, the NIV Application Commentary, which I think this is a good resource overall, if you're looking for a one volume Bible commentary, this is as good as any of the others out there you're going to find. So this makes this unnecessary. I would encourage people, instead of getting this, just get the commentary and then use the NIV Life Application Study Bible if you want those application-focused notes. If you're not into the academic rigor, you're not into the historical background as much, you might want to get, say, Zondervan's Cultural Background Study Bible, which a lot of the same contributors contributed to, and then get the application commentary as your application guide while you're reading it. Graphic-wise, this is minor. I do not like double column with center cross references. That's like probably my least favorite Bible format. So I don't love how this is laid out, but that is pure. That's not a judgment. That's a purely personal thing. You guys know I like single column Bibles. And if you're going to put references, put them in the gutter. I don't just how much room that takes up in the middle of the page, and it breaks it up and you can't see the flow of a passage as well. And it makes the poetry have to be formatted weird. I don't like double column with a center cross reference, but that's purely personal. Other than that, everything about this Bible though it's just fine. Not great, not terrible. It's just fine. I wouldn't warn anybody away from this, but I also would not say, yeah, you need this Bible on your shelf. I genuinely don't think you do. I think you can make an argument that the one volume commentary, if you don't have the set of NIV application commentaries, if you have this set, this is unnecessary. And if you have this volume, this is unnecessary. Those are my honest thoughts. So I appreciate the viewer who sent this to me. Thanks for letting me take a look. I had been interested in it. Zondervan does put out a lot of good stuff. I would not put this in top tier of their resources, but you may disagree. You may find it's exactly what you want. And hopefully this review helps you see what's in it so that you can decide. If you do disagree with me, you're like, no, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I think that's perfect. Then hopefully this video helped you make that decision. If it did, a way you could show your appreciation, if you haven't already, is by subscribing. That's the best way to help this channel. Subscribe, like, share, comment, all of that stuff that is currency in the YouTube ecosystem. Super helpful. But that'll do for now. Thanks for watching. Hope this helped you some, and stay tuned for more Bible and resource reviews here at Disciple Dojo. And in the meantime, as always, keep training.